5, how the New Testament was copied. Now, skeptics are often fond of saying that Jesus in the New Testament has been misquoted beyond recovery, or the text has been miscopied beyond repair. But here's what we're going to find out in this session, is that there are so many copies of the New Testament that it's almost always possible to recover the original reading of every text of your New Testament, even though they were copied by hand for hundreds of years. And in that tiny fraction of times when it isn't possible to recover an original text perfectly, that even in those, it changes nothing that we believe about God or about His work in the world. God has preserved His word sufficiently for us to know His will. Now let's suppose for a moment that you've got a copy of the book that goes with this video series. And then let's suppose that you've got a friend who has the same printing of the same book that you have. I want to let you in on a little secret, an amazing fact that you may not be aware of. Your book and their book are exactly the same. Same page numbers, same content, same pictures on the same pages all the way through. It's an amazing thing. I know you're really shocked that I know that I'm aware of that, but it's true. And here's how I know that. It's because you bought your book after the 15th century. I know, another amazing fact that you don't know how I knew. But in that, the reason for that is because there was a man named Johannes Gutenberg in the 15th century. And Gutenberg came up with an amazing invention. And his invention was a printing press with movable metal type. Now, Gutenberg used his metalworking skills to develop different types of type that were durable and could be used over and over and over and over. Before this time, most documents were produced by copying them by hand. But Gutenberg's printing press made mass duplication of documents possible for the very first time. Now, of course, it added some other things as well. You could also have mass duplication of errors after Gutenberg's printing press. This has happened a few times in the history of the Bible. For example, there's one in 1612 in which in Psalm 119, there's a verse that should say, "Princes have persecuted me," but instead it came out saying, "Printers have persecuted me," which is somewhat true in this particular instance. There's also one that became known as the Wicked Bible, in which in Exodus 20:14, the word "not" was accidentally left out by a printer so that it said, "Thou shalt commit adultery." And another one in Jeremiah chapter 31, they reversed 2 letters so that it said, instead of "I will remember their sin no more," it said, "I will remember their sin on more." But of course, these errors are easily corrected and easily noticeable. They're exceptions. From the beginning of the printing press to the present, errors have been very, very rare. The real question, though, is this. What about those many centuries before the printing press? You see, for more than 1,000 years, the New Testament was copied by hand, using reed pens at first and then quill pens later, by the light of lamps and candles, by men and women who lived before the invention of eyeglasses, before contact lenses. Is it possible that the copies of the New Testament became so corrupted during that time that we no longer know what the originals even said? That's what certain skeptical scholars seem to imply at times. There's one whose name is Bart Ehrman, and he puts it this way. He says, not only do we not have the originals of the Greek manuscripts of the New Testament, we don't even have the first copies of the originals. What we have are copies that are made much later, and these copies differ from one another, he says, in so many ways that we don't even know how many differences there are. But are we really this bad off? Has the New Testament really been so poorly preserved that we can't even be sure what the original words were? When you read your New Testament, can you trust the text that's there, that it's been copied accurately? Well, I want us to look together at 4 very simple facts to see how well the New Testament has been preserved over the centuries. And here's what we'll see. We'll see that the New Testament has been copied with remarkable accuracy, and that no copying variant stands in the way of any truth that we find in the New Testament. Here's the first fact that I want us to understand, and it's that early Christians cared deeply about maintaining the text that they received. And this shouldn't surprise us after all. Most of the early Christians were Jewish. And remember that the Jewish people had preserved for centuries the text of the Old Testament in a highly reliable way. And so they cared deeply about the text, and this carried over into early Christianity. But we have evidence, even in the New Testament, of how much early Christians cared about keeping the text pure in the New Testament. We find it in Revelation chapter 22. We find a warning there where it says, if anyone adds to the words of the prophecy of this book, God will add to that person the plagues in this book. If anyone takes away, then God will take away that person's portion from the tree of life. So we have evidence right there that in the earliest stages of Christianity, even in the first century, they cared deeply about people not adding to or taking from the text that they had received. We see it in the 3rd century as well. There's a theologian named Origen who lived in the city of Alexandria, and he ran across some variants in the text that he had received. And when he looked at those, he kind of burst out in frustration. And he says this, these scribes, they either neglect to check over what they've transcribed, or in the process of checking, they make additions or deletions as they please. We find evidence of this from the 4th century as well. There's a manuscript known as Codex Vaticanus, and an earlier copyist of this codex had changed one of the readings in that text, and a later copyist changed it back to the way it was supposed to be, but he also left a note to that original copyist. And here's the note that he left in the margin: "Fool and knave, leave the old reading, don't change it." So we see early Christians cared deeply about keeping the original text. And this desire shows in the accuracy of the manuscripts that we have. But skeptical scholars, they like to point out that we don't possess the original autographs, that is, the original manuscript of the New Testament. In fact, one says this: not only do we not have the originals, we don't even have the first copies of the originals. All we have are copies made later, much later, as if this somehow shatters the reliability of the New Testament text. And yet the fact is, these texts that we have agree in more than 90% of the time. But not only that, not all the copies were copied much later, as some skeptical scholars like to say. In fact, some of them were copied so early that they may have been around at the same time that some of the original manuscripts still survived. For example, we have Papyrus 52, which is a tiny little piece of John chapter 18. And it was copied sometime in the 2nd century, probably in the first half of the 2nd century AD, only a few decades after John wrote his gospel in the first place. There's Papyrus 104, which is a 2nd century fragment from Matthew chapter 21, copied maybe a century or less after Matthew wrote this gospel as we have it now. There's even a recently discovered fragment of Mark's gospel that was peeled out of the inside of the face mask of a mummy that may come from the late 1st or early 2nd century AD. There are fragments of the New Testament that date to within a few decades of when the texts were originally written. But it's not only fragments that survive to us today. There are manuscripts like Papyrus 66 and Papyrus 45 that contain John's gospel as well as part of Luke's gospel that were copied somewhere around the year 200. Now we could add more and more and more manuscripts and all of this evidence, but the point is simply this: all of these manuscripts and all of these fragments from manuscripts were copied very close to the times when the originals were written. So, have the original manuscripts survived? No, they haven't. And are there variations in some of the copies? Yes, certainly there are. But very early copies survive still today, and these ancient manuscripts were copied by people who cared very deeply about keeping the text that they had received. But there's a second important fact that I want you to know, and it's simply this: the overwhelming majority of all the variations in all the manuscripts have absolutely no impact on the way the text is translated. The best way to help you understand this is simply to give you an example. Now, if you were to look up John chapter 3 and verse 3 in your Bible, here are the first words you would find: Jesus answered and said, or something like that, depending on your translation. Now, if we were to look at that verse in a 4th century manuscript, notice Codex Sinaiticus, which you find at the British Museum, it begins with these 3 Greek words: apokrythe, which means answered; Ha, which means the, and then it would have the letters iota, sigma, which is an abbreviation for Jesus. And often they would do this in the manuscripts where holy names, names of God, names of Jesus, would be simply abbreviated with the first and last letter of that name. So literally, woodenly, that says, answered the Jesus. Now we learned several things from that little snippet of Greek text. First off, they like to speak in Yoda speak. You'll find that in Greek often it will be backwards, like Yoda speaks in Star Wars. But you'll also find that you have the word the in front of Jesus. Ha in Greek, the in front of the word Jesus. You often see that in the Greek language. You'll see that they'll put the word the in front of a person's name or in front of a noun. Now, it's a very common occurrence, but you also find some manuscripts where this doesn't occur in this particular text. So if we were to look up Codex Washingtonianus, which you can find in Washington, D.C. at the Freer Museum, it will simply say apokryphe and then iota sigma. That little ha is missing. The word the is missing. So instead of being translated woodenly, answered the Jesus, it's simply answered Jesus. The ha is missing right there. Now, the presence or the absence of this little definite article has no effect on the meaning whatsoever. And not only does it have no effect in the meaning, it doesn't even come through in your English translation, does it? Because in English, we never put a definite article in front of somebody's name. Now, here's what I want you to understand in this. The overwhelming majority of all these variations in all the Greek manuscripts are that type of variation. Things that don't even come through in our translations. A definite article that gets added, a word that's misspelled, words that are in a different order that don't even show up in our English translations. In fact, in nearly 2/3 of all the verses in all the Greek manuscripts of the New Testament, nearly 2/3 of them, there is not even one single variation of any kind in all of these different verses. But even among those verses that do have variants, the overwhelming majority are the type that we've seen right here. Things where there's a definite article added or dropped out, a misspelling, a word in a different order. All of these are changes, are variations in the copying that we can't even see in an English translation today. But there's also a third important truth I want us to see. And that is that the process of textual criticism can recover nearly every word of the original text of the Greek New Testament. Now, when you hear the word textual criticism, you may feel a little bit nervous because you may think that what that is criticizing or tearing apart the text, attacking the text in some way. But see, the task of a textual critic isn't to tear the text apart, it's rather to put the text together. In other words, what a textual critic does is tries to recover the original wording of the text of the New Testament. So instead of thinking of the word criticize or criticism, think of another meaning of the word criticism, which is close analysis. And so when a textual critic looks at the New Testament, they are closely analyzing all these different fragments, all these different manuscripts, and trying to recover the text of the Greek New Testament as it was originally written. And remember, as you think through this, that there are more than 5,600 ancient Greek manuscripts that have survived today, either in whole or in part. And when we compare that to other ancient writings, we have a wealth of information about the New Testament. Let's compare that just for a moment to Plato, let's say. The writings of Plato, about 200 manuscripts are all that survive. And not only that, the earliest surviving manuscript was copied in the year 895. Now that's 1,300 years after Plato wrote his original works. Only about 200 manuscripts surviving and 1,300 years after Plato wrote his works. Now let's compare that then to the New Testament. What we have in the New Testament is more than 5,600 fragments and manuscripts in whole or in part, all taken together. And in that, some of these come from within decades of the time when the texts were originally written. And some of them we have complete manuscripts of books from less than 2 centuries after the time when they were originally written. So did scribes sometimes make changes as they were copying the New Testament? Of course they did. Yes. Now, most of the time, this is because the scribe was lazy or careless or they were tired and they simply copied a word incorrectly. Now, other times, scribes felt compelled to share with the reader information that they thought the reader needed to know. Great example of this is John chapter 5 and verse 4. In some translations of the Bible, you'll have a little explanatory note in that verse in which it tells you why this disabled man that Jesus is talking to, why he feels like he needs to be tossed into the pool to be healed. And in other versions of the Bible, you won't find that particular little text. Now, what happened in that one is most likely that there was a scribe at some point who knew why this man felt like he needed to be put in this pool, but the scribe felt like that wasn't in the text and he needed to add that in so that people would understand what was being talked about in John chapter 5. But here's what's important in that. Even though there are variations in the copies of the manuscripts that have been made, and even though we are pretty sure that wasn't originally in the text that John wrote, that little explanation, this doesn't change anything that we believe about God, about his work in the world, or even about this particular story. It's simply a variation in copying because there was a copyist who thought that we needed to know a little bit more information. A similar example in Acts chapter 8 and verse 37. So if you will look that up in your Bible, some of you will realize, I can't find it in my Bible when I look up Acts chapter 8 and verse 37. Well, that's because in some manuscripts of the New Testament, that verse appears. Others, it doesn't. What seems to have happened in that is a scribe who was copying this text at some point noticed rightly that throughout the book of Acts, that if somebody was baptized, they also believed in Jesus Christ. And so in this particular text, it doesn't explicitly say that the Ethiopian eunuch believed in Jesus Christ. It simply says that he was baptized. And a particular scribe at some point probably thought, well, I need to make that more explicit. I need to make sure that they know, even though it's in the entire rest of the book of Acts, that I need to let them know for sure that this Ethiopian eunuch most certainly believed in Jesus Christ when he was baptized. And so a scribe added in a sentence there in Acts chapter 8, verse 37. Now, once again, in that particular text, it probably wasn't in the original manuscript that Luke wrote of the book of Acts. But at the same time, it doesn't change anything that we believe about God. All that it does is affirm something that is already told to us throughout the book of Acts, that people, when they were baptized, trusted in Jesus Christ. Now, sometimes a scribe might want to include a well-known tradition. We see an example of that, for example, in Mark chapter 16. At some point, after verse 8, there has been added a section that really tells more about the resurrection appearances of Jesus. Now, this particular text is an independent tradition, apparently, that circulated in the early church, and at some point, a scribe included it, attached that to the gospel according to Mark, after Mark chapter 16 and verse 8. A similar example of this is in John chapter 8, where if you look it up in some of your Bibles, you'll find verses 1 through 11 of chapter 8, and in others, you either won't find those verses, or what you'll find is a note saying that some ancient manuscripts don't include these verses. So what's going on with this? This is the story of the woman caught in adultery. Well, once again, this was a well-known story in the early church that circulated widely, that many people knew about and many people were aware of, and a scribe at some point thought, this is a great story. We need to make sure that it gets included and copied and preserved. And so he puts it in where it doesn't really belong, into John chapter 8, verses 1 through 11. But here's what's important about all of these changes of this sort. None of them, first off, changes anything that we believe about this text, about God, about what he's doing in these books. None of them changes that. Perhaps more importantly, though, because there are so many manuscripts of the Greek New Testament, because there's so many, it's almost always possible to discover when and where these things were added and to recover the original text. In fact, between 97 and 99% of the time, the original text can be recovered beyond any measure whatsoever of reasonable doubt. Think about that for a moment. Between 97 and 99% certainty that what we have in the New Testament is the text as it was originally written by the apostles and by those around the apostles that were telling the story of Jesus. But what about that tiny percentage about which there's uncertainty? What do we do with that? What do we do about those times when we can't be absolutely certain that what we find in a certain manuscript is what was originally written in this manuscript? Well, here's one example to help us understand why these uncertainties don't affect anything that we believe about God or about His work. John chapter 1 and verse 18, if you were to look that up in your Bible, it would say something like this: "No one has ever seen God, the one and only Son who is at the Father's side, He has revealed Him." But if you go to other translations, instead of one and only Son or only begotten Son, it will say one and only God or only begotten God. So what do we do about this text in John chapter 1 verse 18? Is Jesus the one and only God, or is Jesus the one and only Son? Some manuscripts say Son, others say God. But here's what I'd like us to see in that. To ask ourselves the question, is Jesus the one and only God? Well, yes. It lets us know that not only in the rest of the New Testament as a whole, but in John's Gospel. John chapter 20, Thomas falls down on his knees before Jesus and says to him, "My Lord and my God." So that truth is already affirmed in John's Gospel. On the other hand, is Jesus the one and only Son? Well, yes. We know that from a verse as familiar as John 3:16. "For God so loved the world that He gave His one and only Son," or only begotten Son. So what we see in this is that, yes, there are some questions about which of these two was the original wording of John chapter 1. But neither of these changes anything that we believe about God or about His work in the world. Both of them are possible, but neither one changes what we believe about God or about His work. Now, this type of variant is typical of that tiny number, comparatively, of variants that were unresolved, that we don't know which the original reading was, that none of them changes what we believe about God or about His work in the world, and it's clear from the text that what they affirm, even if there are two different variations, either one of them is possible. So remember that key truth from our very first session? It was that the Bible is inerrant in its inspiration, but sufficient in its preservation. Now, as we look at the New Testament manuscripts, here's what we see very clearly: that God has preserved His Word sufficiently for us to recover the message that God intended. And when we study our New Testaments today, we can have absolute confidence that the words we read are the words that were originally written, and in those few instances where there's uncertainty about those words, that the essential message that God has for us in the New Testament as a whole remains unchanged.